Welcome to the Wanderer's History Podcast. This is Vlad Zamfira, and I'm glad to introduce you to the first episode of the podcast. It is a topic very close to my heart, one that I've studied for at least 4 years. Venice, myth, republic, empire. Now, Venice, a name that has a lot of meaning for a lot of people. Whether you're talking about the current Italian city, or you're a fan of Shakespeare's Merchant in Venice, or Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, this name has drawn fascination from numerous individuals from all sorts of domains, including myself. I wrote my 4th-year history dissertation on the decline of the Venetian Republic and the Third Venetian-Ottoman War. Later on, I continued with my master's thesis, where I talked at length about the Fourth Ottoman War and the decline of Venetian imperialism in the second half of the 16th century. The thematic wallpaper of this podcast is a painting of Abraham Cresques, 14th century cartographer, which is called The Caravan of Marco Polo Traveling in the Indies. The reason why I chose something related to Marco Polo specifically, renowned Venetian explorer, merchant, writer, and may I also say a wanderer, is that he is very symbolic to what this podcast aims to be. And that is an exploration experience, historical of course, narrated through the waves of the internet. Returning to today's episode, nowadays Venice is one of the most popular tourist locations, not just in Italy, but also in Europe and I would say in the world. According to a recent article in The Telegraph, around 22 million tourists visit Venice every year. And it's quite a large city with a surface encompassing a bit more over 160 square miles. What makes Venice fairly unique is the fact that, of course, it's a canal city, a lagoon city. It has numerous nicknames such as the Floating City, City of Bridges, City of Canals, and back in the day, Venice was also known as the Queen of the Adriatic City. When discussing about Venice from a historical perspective, there are two options which are a bit different. You have the history of the city of Venice, and then you had the history of the Republic of Venice, or the most serene Republic of Venice, a state/republic that was founded in 697 AD that lasted until 1797. 11 centuries of intriguing history. For the most part, we will discuss about the history of the Republic, which also included the city, again until 1797. Now, the fascinating aspect about Venice was that in a time when kings, emperors, and sultans reigned supreme in Europe and the world, Venice was different. It had a separation of power within the state system, in the sense that Venice had a senate, a collegio, a council of 10, and a doge. These being the main institutions. Of course, there were other institutions such as the College of Rectors, the Consiglio Maggiore, and many other institutions. Think about the fact that, let's say in the 1100s, when Europe was still in the Dark Ages, there was a prosperous Venetian Republic in a time when the only European factions that resembled any sense of proper civilization were the Holy Roman Empire here and there, and I would say the Byzantine Empire. You had a proto-republic in the 1100s, more than 600 years before the first properly founded and stable republic, which from my point of view would be the United States of America. From a territorial point of view, Venice had an intriguing composition. The terraferma, which was the mainland Italian territory of the Republic, comprised of what is today the Veneto region in the northeast of Italy, the Italian peninsula, but also the Venetian Republic back in those days had in its components cities like Brescia and Bergamo and Piacenza. Yet Venice also had a Stato da Mar, which was a largely Mediterranean dominion system, which included places and cities like Thessaloniki, Dubrovnik, Cyprus, and Crete. A wide variety there. In my postgraduate research, I argued that Venice had a Mediterranean empire on which it heavily relied economically, as for example, Cyprus and Crete acted as proxies for the Republic's Levantine trade. Now, some people would think that associating the terms republic and empire in a Venetian context might be particularly strange given their rather antonymic meanings. Yes, Venice did not have an emperor or a king, yet it did have a princely figure in the Doge. Venetian scholars such as John Martin and Dennis Romano, in a book called Venice Reconsidered, The History and Civilization of an Italian City-State, called Venice as, quote, one of Europe's most enduring republics, an expansive empire, and from the 15th century onwards, an imposing regional state. Now, you also have a couple, I would call them Republican absolutists, lots of Venetian historians who don't agree with this correlation between the terms republic and empire. And in order to avoid this taboo-ish controversy, you have a lot of historians who agree with this concept, yet they don't name it. For example, Maria Fusaro, she agrees with the concept, yet prefers to always use the term Stato da Mar. And in one instance, she calls Venice an empire without an emperor. So she goes rather the metaphoric way of doing things. All of this can be reflected in the fact that if you ask the vast majority of people to name you the most powerful empires from the past, a lot of those people would answer British, Spanish, French empires. Some of them would mention the Holy Roman Empire and, of course, the Roman Empire, but that goes a bit too far in the past. But coming back to the Venetian state, by the 1500s, Venice was one of the most powerful European states, mainly because of two aspects. The first aspect would be a profoundly strategic Venetian mercantilism, or in other words, a strong reliance on a financial sector derived from Levantine trade from the Levant. In other words, Venice was one of the wealthiest states in Europe, I would say in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries as well. The second aspect is intrinsically linked with the first one, and it's the fact that Venice, for a long, long time, ever since its foundation up until its downfall, Venice always relied on a tremendous fleet. Tremendous, I say, from 2 points of view: a technological one, and also in terms of the size of the fleets. A very good way to make the case for an imperial Venice would be to compare the Venetian Mediterranean Commonwealth with one of the, I would say, most famous empires, and that would be the English/British Empire. To begin with, we are talking about slightly different periods when these empires operated, and more specifically when both of the Venetian Republic or Commonwealth and the English/British Empire reached their peaks. And that is fairly important to mention. As I argued before, Venetian decline in the Mediterranean became quite profound by 1574, which was the end of the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War, also known as the War of Cyprus. And in that period of time, the Venetians basically were not able to trade in the Levant, which was, of course, as I said before, their main economic engine. Interestingly enough, the English took advantage of the opportunity, and in 1581, they go to Syria, parts of Syria, which back in those days belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and they founded the English Levant Company. So England, and later on Britain, after 1606, became a strong colonial power. Another fundamental difference would be the sizes of the British Empire and the Venetian Commonwealth. By the time it reached its peak, the British Empire had accumulated a surface of more than 30 million square kilometers. The British Empire covered territories from all across the globe, from Africa, the Americas, Asia, to the Pacific. On the other hand, the Venetian Commonwealth was much, much smaller. With the exception of a trading outpost in Tana, near Azov, the Venetian Commonwealth was entirely based in the Mediterranean, most important possessions being Cyprus and Crete. So 99% of the Venetian Commonwealth was actually based and confined in the Mediterranean. Returning to similarities between the British Empire and the Venetian Commonwealth. In terms of imperial structures, they were quite similar. A strong metropole, such as London, was very similar to Venice and Padua. Both factions had one of the best, if not the best, fleets and sailors at their times. Both ruled over culturally different factions. The Venetians mainly ruled over Greek/Byzantine dominions. However, in cases such as Cyprus, which was a melting pot, you had Jews, Syrians, Copts, Armenians, Ottomans, and even Moldovans. The main problem that Venice faced in the administration of its Commonwealth was the fact that the Venetians were a Latin minority that ruled over a Greek Orthodox majority, which is one of the reasons why the Venetian Commonwealth crumbled in time, because of their maladministration, but also because of the proximity to an ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. To conclude on this point, both the Venetian Commonwealth and British Empire were incredibly rich factions, mainly as a result of trade. Moving on, another particular trait of Venetian republicanism was its semi-tolerance with other religious groups. Fundamentally, a Catholic state, one of the main reasons for Venice's financial success and prosperity was its trade with Muslim states, such as the Mamluks in Egypt, the Syrians, the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and so on, in a time when papal bulls threatening excommunication of all Catholic states that did so was a common occurrence. Venice allowed different Christian denominations, such as Orthodox or Protestants, to live, study, and trade in the terraferma. For example, Udine was in the 15th and 16th centuries a prime location for both Catholics and Protestants from Germany to study. As for the matter of decline, people might ask this. If Venice was so wealthy and prosperous, why did it disappear in 1797? The first answer to that would be the demolition of its commonwealth, mainly at the hands of the Ottomans, which was a gradual, fairly slow, but sure, definite process. Just to name a few examples. The Siege of Thessalonica concluded with the Ottoman conquest in 1430. 1571, Cyprus fully conquered after the fall of Famagusta. 1669, Crete falls in the hands of the Turks at the end of the Fifth Ottoman-Venetian War. 1718, Tenos, one of the last Venetian strongholds in the Aegean, falls into the hands of the Ottomans. And this is not counting other defeats, such as the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396. Now, there were victories, of course, such as the one at Gallipoli in 1416, which eventually resulted in a bit of a stalemate with the Ottomans, or in Lepanto in 1571. However, if you put it on, let's say, imaginary scales, Ottoman victories would drastically outweigh any Venetian successes. Those Ottoman conquests and subsequent defeats of the Venetian Republic were also linked with Venetian poor administration of its dominions, especially in places like Cyprus. In other words, Venice made the job much easier for the Ottomans to come in and conquer places like Cyprus and Crete. The degradation of its commonwealth, the Venetian Commonwealth, resulted in a reduction of Levantine trade, the main economic engine of the Republic. Throughout its history, especially after the 14th century, one of the main policies of the Venetian Republic was to avoid at all costs war against the Ottoman Empire. And that was because of two reasons. First of all, in many cases, that would imply almost a certain loss, because the Venetians did not have that many allies, and when it did have allies, such as in the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War, you had a bankrupt papacy and a reluctant Spanish king to help. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Venetians would most likely lose the war against the Ottomans, but most importantly, during the exact period of the war, for example, 1570 to 1573, trade with the Levant would be non-existent for the Venetians, and that was catastrophic because not much revenue was coming in. There were embargoes placed on Venetian merchants and properties in, for example, in Galata, in the Italian district in Constantinople. And in situations like that, the Venetian patriciate, the Senate, and even the Doge were desperate for finances, and they were getting loans at ridiculous interest rates, such as 30 or 35%. Also, from the 16th century onwards, the Venetians faced increased competition from other factions such as Ragusa, Genoa, Spain, France, and Portugal in the Mediterranean. And it was a fierce competition, especially in those periods of sanctions that I told you about, sanctions from the Ottomans. And the Ottomans were not the only threat the Venetians had to consider. There were also European foes, as for example, at the beginning of the 16th century, in the first decade, Venice was nearly obliterated by the League of Cambrai, when you have the famous defeat at Agnadello, and Venice is just resumed to mainly the lagoons, Venice and Padova. Venice could not deal militarily with all of its enemies, and in fact, it was diplomacy that saved the Republic on countless occasions. As previously mentioned, the Venetian economy depended on a volatile and unpredictable Ottoman Empire. And as that wasn't enough, there were numerous tensions with the papacy that culminated with Medici popes such as Leo X and Clement VII that detested the Republic and wanted it to be destroyed. Pope Paul V placed the infamous interdict of 1606-1607 on Venice, with Venetian historian William Bousma arguing in his book entitled Venice and the Defense of Republican Freedom that the interdict was the moment Venetian decline was actually irreversible. The Venetians did not have reliable allies in crucial moments, such as the conquest of Cyprus. Cyprus was in part lost because of the inability of Venice to convince a reluctant and defensive Spanish fleet to help them confront the Ottoman navy. More of this will be discussed in a future episode, which will examine the European disunity when it came to confronting and defeating the Ottoman Empire. Also, another reason for Venetian decline was the fact that its fleet steadily disappeared. From having around 200 ships, that is galleys, galleons and transports, in the 16th century, in its final moments in 1796, Venice only had 4 galleys and 7 galleons, 11 ships that could barely guard the lagoon. With the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, which basically confirmed the victory of Napoleonic forces in Italy, Venice was partitioned, with the Austrian Habsburgs as main beneficiaries, as they gained a lot of Venetian territory and thus established a solid foothold in Italy, at least until 1866. So, by the end of the 18th century, Venice was no more than a shell of its former self. All that was left was the art, the history, the churches, statues, and tombs of famous Venetian doges such as Andrea Gritti and Alvise Mocenigo, proud defenders of Venetian republicanism and of the Republic of Venice. Now, it is impossible to condense all Venetian history in under an hour. Countless research papers have been written about the intricacies of the Venetian Republic, with much more that is left to still be uncovered. For sure, it will not be the last time I will discuss about Venice. In fact, There will be episodes dedicated to Venetian art, which are still in very early development stages. This was the first proper episode of the podcast, and of course, it may have its imperfections. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will stay tuned for future episodes of the Wanderer's History podcast. Until then, all the best.